So welcome to this afternoon's online training session into working with and creating images for publication, hosted by the IHR Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. So in the first half of the session, Jamie Bowman from University of London Press is going to talk to us about working with images in publications, the mechanics of permissions, copyright and supplying images that publishers can use. Jamie is the production manager at University of London Press, overseeing the processes of taking manuscripts and images and making them into finished books. And then in the second half of the session, Matt Bristow from Historic England will then be using buildings photography as an example to introduce some of the practical considerations around taking your own images with publication in mind. So this involves accessing your subject and permissions and how to try and take a good picture. So Matt is Senior Investigator in Historic England's research group. He specialises in landscape and buildings archaeology with research interests which include church architecture, village and town morphology, the buildings of the agricultural and industrial revolutions, new towns and non-traditional housing types in the 20th century. So pretty much everything, I think, Matt. Anyway, Jamie, over to you to begin.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So as Ruth said, I am production manager at the University of London Press, where I've been for about 5 years. And I'm going to talk through the publisher side of things in terms of images. So just to say, this is more about kind of the publisher perspective as opposed to self-publishing, but hopefully there'll be some useful overlap if that's where you're coming from. So just to kick off with a quick caveat that different publishers will have slightly different approaches to this, but most of what I'm going to say should apply generally to most academic publishers. But any publisher worth their salt will have some guidelines that are always worth checking for the finer details on this sort of thing. So what I'm going to cover is the use of illustrations. I'm going to talk a little bit about resolution. I'm going to talk a bit about colour, dreaded permissions, and also the use of captions. I'm going to talk for about 15, maybe 20 minutes, and then pause for some questions. So to start with the use of illustrations, there's generally a kind of process of negotiation with publishers about the use of images in the book based on the book. There's lots of factors involved and what is kind of deemed central to the argument. So most academic publishers won't allow the use of decorative images, generally speaking, and they'll also often have a cap on the number of illustrations that will be submitted as part of the manuscript, and also kind of requirements around how they're going to be laid out and things like that. So always talk to your editor about that sort of thing if that's where you're up to at that stage, but also just kind of bear in mind that there are going to be those kind of restrictions when approaching publishers. So don't be put off by that. That's just, yeah, that's the way the publishers work. So the publisher restrictions, I'm using restrictions, probably the wrong word because it's quite off-putting. They're guidelines, but it's that process of negotiation that I'm talking about. So refer to those when kind of looking at your images. So I'm going to move on to talk about resolution, which is one of the guidelines that you'll see come up a lot in publisher guidelines or checklists. So the requirements around resolution are to do with how they will appear in print, and you have to submit them at certain resolutions in order for that to be able to be legible when it is put into print. That depends on a few things like format, the size of the book, obviously, but there's some kind of benchmarks that most publishers tend to use, which are worth aiming for. Generally, publishers split illustrations into two types. We talk about line art and we talk about halftones. Line art, generally, to put it simply, is anything that is usually solid black with no grays. It can also be color, but generally tends to be black. The primary thing about line art is that only solid color is used, as opposed to halftones, which have variations in tone that allow the printer to be able to simulate different colors in the process colors that are used for printing, which are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, the CMYK colors that we talk about in printing. So they're that's the main distinction that you'll see in terms of illustrations, and that feeds into some of the requirements that publishers have about what you are submitting. So if you are submitting something like a graph, which would be considered line art, then you would have slightly different requirements than if you're submitting an illustration, picture of a painting, or something that would be considered a halftone. So the first thing that you'll see often is PPI, which stands for pixels per inch. And for halftones, the benchmark that publishers tend to want from you is 300 PPI. And for line art, you're generally looking at 1200 PPI for, it's worth saying that this is for print purpose. You can get away with different resolutions for different formats. So for the web, that number tends to be less, can be 150, even as low as 72 sometimes. There are different ways to check the PPI of the images that you're working with. It can be done just using the file explorer on your computer and opening an image and looking at the file information. I would also recommend, if you're working with lots of images, something a little bit more robust, something like Adobe Bridge, which I'm pretty sure is free, which is something that I use personally. And that allows you to look at all of your images or your assets generally and look at things like metadata. It shows you their size, their resolution. It's a really useful tool if you're working with lots of images. So resolution is to do with the quality of the image, and that feeds into the next point, which is about the size of the image. So the publisher needs to be able to reproduce your image at a particular size and retain the quality, which is expressed in the pixels per inch, the resolution that I just talked about. So depending on the size of the book, and the publisher will obviously be able to tell you what format your book is going to be and the width of your page. So using that dimension, you'll be able to work out from the size of your image whether it will retain that quality at that size. So say, for example, your page width of the book is 4.5 inches, and your image is, say, 1500 pixels. You can then use that dimension to find out. So you would say 1500 pixels divided by the page width 4.5, which I can't do off the top of my head, but you would work out whether that is more than 300 pixels per inch, and then it would retain the quality that you need for that size. So that is something that the publisher will be doing, and there's a lot of back and forth involved in that. You don't necessarily have to do all of that yourself. I'm just saying that this is what is happening kind of on the publisher side, and it's worth knowing about if you are going to be working with lots of images and submitting images to your publisher. If you have lots of images and you're unsure, it's worth sending a sample to your publisher, and they will be able to check and make sure that you're kind of on the right track in that regard. So that's resolution size. The other thing is file type. Publishers in their guidelines will tell you generally kind of what file types they are happy to take. Generally, they're going to want something that contains the most quality that you can get. That's normally a TIFF file, which can be very big. So you're working with quite large files when you're talking about TIFF files. And then PNG you would see, and then JPEGs tend to be kind of lower down on the spectrum of quality, though are used quite commonly. We as a publisher accept all of these, but some publishers will only accept some of those. So it's worth checking if your files are in the right type. The other thing to note there is those files that I'm talking about are generally, we're talking about halftones there, but if you're working with line art, then you'll ideally want what are called vector files. So there we're looking at EPS files, can be PDFs, and that allows the publisher to retain the quality when changing the size of the image. So if you're working with an illustrator, for example, then they would know this kind of thing, and they will give you the right types of files. If you're doing it yourself, then you need to use a program like Illustrator, for example, to export those file types, because generally that's what your publisher would ask of you. In terms of color, again, that's going to be something that you'll agree with your publisher. A lot of publishers will only reproduce images in black and white in print, and then color for kind of digital editions. So that's something that obviously you need to know. That doesn't mean that you have to do the color conversion yourself. You can submit in color. It's just worth knowing that that's going to be the end result of your image, because, you know, if the image relies on the fact that it's in color, then that's going to be an issue. Likewise with line art, where, say, certain graphs where the information is expressed in color, if it's going to end up black and white, then that's going to undermine it. So there'll be a conversation there with your publisher about whether you're going to be publishing in color or in black and white. So that's an important consideration. So onto permissions, which is obviously a huge topic. Generally speaking, most publishers are going to ask you to clear permissions yourself before you submit your final manuscript and your images. And that's going to be for anything that is not your own work or anything that's not in the public domain. So anything that has a copyright holder, you're going to have to clear the permissions yourself. Publishers will give you guidance and assistance with that. Some of them have teams, but it's a big area that takes a lot of work and potentially hold up the process. So generally speaking, most publishers would expect that that's being done at submission stage. So the permissions, there are all sorts of factors that go into what type of permission you will need to clear. So intended use is one of them. So if your book is being published as a print book, then that will be a specific type of permission that you'll need. And if it's being published online or as an ebook, then there'll be other types of permission that you'll need. So for example, your online edition, there'll be kind of tiers around how popular that image is likely to be, how many eyeballs it's going to have on it, essentially, and that will kind of dictate sort of the permissions that you might require. There may also be the copyright holder, may also have some specific requirements about things like the resolution that it's reproduced at. So going back to resolution, spoke about earlier, they may not allow you to reproduce the image at certain resolutions. So that's worth bearing in mind. Also the number of copies that are going to be printed. So similar to kind of how many eyeballs will be on a web page looking at that image that the copyright holder has the copyright to. They'll want to know how many copies of the book are being printed, because that might take you up into another tier of permissions that you have to clear. Also, whether it's being used as a cover image, that's a big one, because that will change kind of where it sits in terms of what permission you have to acquire. Again, as I said before, your publisher will be able to guide you on this. So do check if you're in doubt. It's definitely worth mentioning to any copyright holders that you approach that your illustrations are being used for research purposes, if that's the case, especially if it's non-commercial, because in some cases they may waive the license fees that the these different types of permissions would attract. Certain organizations, off the top of my head, National Portrait Gallery does this. They have a specific academic license that is free of charge, which allows you to get an image at a certain resolution that you would need for a publisher, free of charge. So that's worth looking into if that's the case for you. So just to kind of clarify on that point, so it's definitely worth keeping an eye out for the different types of licenses that an organization has. So you may think that you're getting an image for free, you're getting a license to use an image, but that free image is not actually suitable for publication because the resolution is too low. So this is quite a common thing where you think that you're able to use images for free, but actually, in order to get something that's print quality, you have to pay the copyright holder to be able to license it. And that's usually things to do with resolution. So you may be able to get a free 72 ppi version of an image, but in order to get a 300 ppi image that the publisher needs, you'll have to pay. Likewise, things to do with the print runs and how many people view a web page that I mentioned before. The copyright holder might license the illustration to you under a Creative Commons license. So they come in different flavors. So it's worth making sure that whatever Creative Commons license it's being licensed under permits your intended use. Some of them have restrictions. So that's worth consulting the Creative Commons license website to check that you can do what you want to do with that image. For example, some of them don't allow any modifications without written permission, things like that. Even something as simple as cropping, the copyright holder, whether it's Creative Commons or not, they may require you to get written permission for that. So it's worth checking, the conditions of the license. And the publisher will ask for those as well. So if there's any specific requirements about the use, then you'll have to tell your publisher where the modifications are allowed, because they may want to do some redrawing during production and they need to know whether they can do that or not. Also, something like a copyright holder might want a copy of the book when it's published. So that's worth telling your publisher, obviously, that they need to do that to meet the conditions of the license. If you're using your own images, which Matt's going to talk a bit more about, then you can choose to license them how you like, and your publisher should be able to give you some guidance on which types of license you use. So, for example, we tend to publish open access, and we guide authors on kind of what licenses to choose from that Creative Commons, those different flavors of Creative Commons licenses. When it's published in the book, it's not required for you to say that the illustration is by you as the author, but it's helpful to do that, and also distinguishes it from any illustrations that are being used in the book that aren't by you, where you'll have to state the copyright holder. Just to touch on costs briefly, so this process, this permissions clearance process, can be quite costly, and generally speaking, the publisher requires the author to pay for that cost, to bear that cost. All of those details will be in your contract with your publisher, but it's worth knowing that there can be some additional costs for you as an author at that point. There is some funding available for some of these things. Again, your publisher should be able to guide you a little bit on this kind of stuff. I know that the IHR has been quite good at pointing people towards the Scaludi Foundation, which awards up to £1,000 towards the production cost of a book or article published in the area of history. So that's worth bearing that in mind. And related to cost, timing. So the reason that publishers require that permissions are cleared at submission is because they want to get started on turning your manuscript into a book. And permissions can really hold things up at that stage. Obviously, depending on the organization, hearing back from somebody about acquiring copyright can be a really lengthy process. Sometimes these organizations are quite small and there's only one person who's dealing with permissions requests, and you might not get a response for a really long time, which can really slow things down. So it's really worth starting that process as soon as possible. Make sure you've got your permissions in order, and that will just make everything much smoother. So yeah, definitely allow as much time for that as you can as possible. To close with image captions, so start with labeling. So generally, your publisher is going to ask you to label your images in a specific way, and they'll have a system for that, and they'll give you the guidelines related to that. Normally, it's with reference to each chapter, but it depends slightly on the publisher. It could be continuous. And this is particularly important because publishers will ask you to supply your image files separately to the manuscript. The manuscript will normally just have placeholders in that tell you where the images are going to go. And that's because Word is not sufficient to submit images. It can compress images in a way that's undesirable. So you want to submit the original file. Likewise with, just on that actually, likewise with certain images, especially things like JPEGs, you're going to want to send the publisher the original file that you have. The more you open it and kind of play around with it, you may end up with compression happening to the image, and it may not be suitable for the publisher. So you're going to want to supply the original file as you received it from the copyright holder, if that's the case for you. So in terms of the captions, just going back to the permissions briefly, the copyright holder may have some very specific wording about the image that they've licensed to you, and you need to use that particular wording, including a credit line with an attribution to wherever the image came from. So yeah, this is just normally the title of the illustration, but it could also include things like an asset number or collection reference, depending on where you got the illustration from. And it should also note the specific license that's being used, if that's applicable. So if it's a Creative Commons license, it should say which, because that signals to other people who may want to use the image what they can and can't do. And the last thing to say on captions, this is a relatively, I mean, it's been around for a little while, but relatively new in terms of some of the legislation. So talking about alt text or alternative text, which is it's a requirement of the European Accessibility Act, which is coming into force next year for digital products. So again, this is obviously format specific, but depending on the format of your book, your publisher may require you to write some alternative text. Again, caveat, publishers are doing different things about this, but it may fall to the author to write this text. And alternative text is different to a caption in that it's description that's more, it's pure description in the sense that it's for people who might be using a screen reader, who need a description of the image. It can also be for places where the image is too slow to load, and you'll see the alternative text before you'll see the image. So it's different to a caption, which is kind of giving you more of a sense of the image and its salience, but this is a purely descriptive form of captioning. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of publisher requirements. I know it sounds like we have a lot, but it just makes the process a lot smoother. So it's worth bearing all these things in mind when you are approaching a publisher, and obviously a lot of this rests on it being in your contract. But most publishers will publish their guidelines publicly, so I recommend having a look around at some publishers that you're interested in, seeing what their guidelines say, and seeing how that can help you kind of prepare in advance, so you're in a good position when you do come to have those conversations with publishers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. There's already at least one question in the chat, but if anybody else has any other questions, please either write one in the chat or use the raise hand function. So Zainab has asked, she said, thank you so much for this informative talk. Am I right in thinking that the resolution is not an inherent quality of a picture, and we can maximize the resolution of a photo, its pixel per inch, for publication by decreasing its size?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. So generally I would speak to your publisher about it. There's a lot of kind of misconceptions around some things related to resolution, especially people thinking that they can kind of increase resolution in images, so it's creating like detail where it doesn't exist. There are kind of things you can do, but generally the learning curve is quite steep for kind of retouching images in this way. So yeah, when a publisher is setting your image, there'll be something called effective PPI, which is kind of how it appears. So that's kind of what I was referring to in terms of working out the dimension of the width of the book and calculating how the quality that it's going to appear at.
Thank you. So Julia's just asked for confirmation about the 300 and the 120. Are they with the half tone or the line drawing? Which is which?
Yeah, sorry. I skipped over that quite quickly. So the half tone is 300 ppi. That's the general benchmark. And the line drawing, line art, as it's sometimes called, is 1200 ppi. Thank
you. Please do keep putting questions in the chat or raising your hand. I had a question around if the image you receive is in a JPEG format, is it possible to convert it into a TIFF if that's what required by the publisher?
Not that way round. Okay. You can convert from TIFF to other formats. I mean, there are various conversions that you can do, and you only have to type into Google convert, X file to Y file, and you'll see all sorts of free online converters. I'd just be a bit wary about doing that. Definitely ask for guidance. It depends where you're starting, where you're going, in terms of the conversion and what you may or may not lose along the way. And generally always try and go for the highest quality file that you can get your hands on and send it to your publisher in the original format.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that anybody has before we say thank you to Jamie? No, it looks like that might be it. Jamie, you did say that you would be happy to take questions by email.
Yeah, I'll let me just drop my email in the chat. If anyone has any questions, then feel free to follow up.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll let Jamie go off because he needs to go and do something else. But thank you very much, Jamie. Hugely appreciated. Okay, so as we're sort of only half an hour through, I think, Matt, if you're there and ready to go, we can move straight on to you. Are you happy to carry on? Fantastic. So as I said earlier, this is Matt Bristow, and he's going to talk to us about taking photographs effectively.
Thanks, Ruth. Right, let me just start this. Can everybody see this presentation?
Yeah, looks great.
Sorry, I can't see any of you in the presentation mode, so I'll take silence as affirmation. Okay, so I think the first thing to say is that I am not a photographer. I wouldn't consider myself a professional photographer by any sort of shape of the imagination. And having worked with those that are, Historic England have an in-house team of photographers. The results that they produce are, I mean, absolutely gobsmacking to me, really. As an amateur, but what I have got is the thick end of 20 years experience of doing field work, of looking at buildings, of looking at landscapes, of taking photographs both for record, but also with a view to publishing them, to using them, and creating images that are likely to meet the requirements that that Jamie's just set out in terms of resolution, in terms of quality, in terms of their sort of reproducibility. Also, as a long-term employee of the VCH, very aware that sometimes the budgets don't exist in order to buy images in to illustrate your work, and that where possible, taking them yourselves can be a more cost-effective option. So what I'm going to run through today really is not a guide, you know, a step-by-step guide to photography per se, but maybe some tips, some things that I've learned over the years. Lots of images for you to look at. It is worth saying that photography is an absolutely gargantuan topic, which can be incredibly technical in terms of sort of camera setup and settings, and you know, quite broad in terms of the sort of artistic flair that you can bring to it. So I won't make no sort of apologies for failing to cover the entire discipline in the next 30 minutes. But hopefully some of the things that I'm going to throw out there, both in terms of the practicalities and also maybe some of the thinking behind the process of taking photos, may be of use. And I'm more than happy at the end for this to become a bit more discursive and have a bit of a chat, and try and answer where I can any sort of practical considerations and concerns you might have. So me, so the fresh-faced youth on the left is me at the beginning of my journey with the Victoria County history. So that's about 2006. Sat on top of the roof of Parham House in West Sussex, large Elizabethan E-plan manor house. I include this one really because quite a lot of the kind of work that I do and have done, and Ruth herself does for the VCH as well, you're not going out principally with photography in mind. You're going out to look, to investigate, to analyze and assess, but the camera's never far away, and that allows you to take advantage of opportunities like this, where I was expecting to be going to look at the landscape, and was surprisingly offered a chance to crawl through a couple of very small spaces and end up on the roof, which gave amazing views out over the park and over the roof structure itself, which I would have been kicking myself had I not brought a camera. And the image on the right is me now. I work for Historic England. I'm a landscape archaeologist, largely spend my time surveying lumps and bumps in remote parts of the countryside. But as part of that, we increasingly use drones and UAVs for survey and recording, which, and I'll move on to those slides towards the end, another huge subject, open up all sorts of opportunities for generating really good imagery of buildings, landscapes, and places. So I think the first thing I'd like to say is that photography really, I found, is always a trade-off between the quality of the photograph that you can take and the amount of time you need to spend in order to achieve that. It's a very sort of broad rule of thumb, but essentially the longer you spend, the longer you devote to it, both in the planning, in the setup, in the waiting for the right light, for the right moment, the better the photograph is likely to be. So although I would love to have the time to do more of the photographs on the left, this is a photograph taken of the church that I got married in at about 1 o'clock in the morning. So all the street lights have been turned off, no light pollution. And I took 200 90-second exposures and then stacked them on top of each other, which allows you to see all of the different pixels of the stars as the Earth rotates around, and giving this amazing star trail effect. Versus the photograph on the right, which was whilst on the train back from West Cornwall, prior to making the Tamar crossing. The train stopped before it made the unexpectedly stopped before it made the crossing. I was on a train that had the old-fashioned pull down windows and slam doors, and was able to take a really nice, completely impromptu photograph of Brunel's Bridge. You know, zero planning, zero time to think, to set up, no tripod, but a really good opportunity to take a photograph from a vista that you wouldn't always get. So I think the kind of work that I do, and I imagine a number of you do as well, photography is a sort of a byproduct of the visits that you're making, of the going out to look at things. So there's always going to be a trade-off between the amount of time you can, excuse me, the amount of time that you can spend and the amount of time that you've got available. The photographers that Historic England have will often stalk a place sort of relentlessly to identify when the absolute best time to photograph it is. I remember our lead photographer explaining that one site, there was only one afternoon per year that the light was right in order to get the right photograph of it. And for 2 years it rained on that day. So it was, when he finally got it, it was a photograph 3 years in the making. Now, though that's the extreme example, but it is something really worth bearing in mind, that all of your photography is likely to be a trade-off between time and opportunity. So there are obviously a range of types of camera available to you, and they all do slightly different things, and they afford you more or less opportunities to improve quality, whereas the ones which offer you probably less quality offer you sort of expediency and immediate and a sort of availability. So a digital single lens reflex, an SLR camera, these are the digital equivalent of your standard film camera. These have the most available options in terms of manual setup, both concerning focusing, but also shutter speed, aperture width. You can have almost complete control over the amount of light that's entering the lens to digitally expose your photograph. The downside of using these is they are quite expensive when compared to a compact digital camera, and can be quite daunting to use, although they all come with sort of automatic settings that will take care of all of that light stuff for you. They are incredibly complicated pieces of equipment and do take a bit of getting used to. The compromise position would be a bridge camera. So this is a digital camera, less expensive, often with a single integrated lens, although some of them do come with interchangeable lenses to give you different focal lengths and widths. You can see, if I flick between the two, the jog dial at the top, you've got similar sort of ranges of options. You can put it in manual mode, you can change the aperture and the aperture and shutter speed to change how you expose the photographs. But these are a lot less money, and they're not quite as customizable in the settings as an SLR camera is. A compact digital camera, or the kind we're all familiar with, these tend to have smaller sensors, so offer you less resolution, though still would deliver the photographs at the kind of resolution that publishers would require, and far less manual settings. And we'll move on to some of those a little bit later, but they're largely point and shoots, but still, you know, will often come with quite high grade lenses. This Sony one is a Zeiss lens, and will deliver really nice and very easy and immediate results. And increasingly smartphones. If you are, shamelessly sort of a shameless consumer like I am, and regularly upgrade your phone, you'll notice that the cameras that come within them are upgrading quicker than the digital compact cameras. So very rarely now do I bother taking a digital compact or even a bridge camera out. I'll shoot stuff on my iPhone, unless I'm trying to take something a bit more fancy. And lastly, but definitely by no means least, drones and UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. As I said, we make a huge use of these now, and these sub 250 gram ones are shown in the picture. That's a DJI Mini 4. Allow you to fly them with far less restrictions on where and when you can fly them. You can fly them in what's called the open category, which means they are really open to everybody. And the price point that they come in now, they're very much a sort of a consumer product, and open up a huge sort of wide range of opportunities in terms of image capture. One thing before I would start, I would say, remember the tripod is your friend. It's not just a hindrance or sort of the the preserve of the old-fashioned photographer taking the portraits. When we go on to talk about some of the settings, and particularly changing the shutter speed to allow more or less light into the photograph, you really do want your camera on a tripod, because otherwise you'll get shake and you'll get blurring. But also, setting up on the tripod does encourage you to take a little more time to ensure your shot is level, but also to think a bit more about your composition. It's not point and click. You're thinking about your setup. You're thinking about what's in the image, what's not in the image. And as we'll move on to, composition really is key to the end result. So when you're going out, you can't ever be too prepared, really. Think about your visits. Don't simply pitch up to where you're going and hope that things will be right. Obviously very basic, but do look at the weather forecast. That will have a huge impact on the quality of the photos you're going to produce. But there's lots of apps online which will tell you where the sun's going to be in the sky at certain points on the days you're going. Have a think about where other buildings stand in relation to the building you're interested in. Are they going to throw shade? Are they going to ruin your photograph? Will there be parked cars outside? Is it bin day? Things like that will all contribute. And then you can start to think about planning your itinerary around when you need to be at various places to maximize your chance of capturing a nice photograph. There's no point getting it the wrong way round and pitching up in the morning where all the things you want to look at are in complete shade. And then had you reversed your day around, then you would have got them looking a bit more sort of photo conducive. And it sounds obvious, but what kind of photograph are you going to take? What are you shooting for? So historic England and the VCH to an extent deal very much in what are called record images. A very austere, square on, very, very level shot that provides a point in time record of that building. There's very little attempts to do fancy things with the lighting or with the camera itself to make things more artistic. Efforts are made to remove things that would date that image, street furniture, people, cars. The idea is that although it's a point in time record, the image should be relatively timeless. This is Parent House again in Sussex. Or are you conducting some kind of photo survey? Is your attempt to create a complete photographic record of the building or the landscape or the thing that you're interested in which case less time is taken on trying to create that one really nice image, and more time is given to making sure that every aspect is photographed from every angle, so you've got a complete record. Is it a fieldwork image? Are you there really to look, less to photograph, and what you're creating is an aide-memoire to yourself? A word of warning is that fieldwork images can often become publication images if nothing else exists. You might be afforded access to a place or a building that when you then ask someone to go and photograph it, or you'd like to go back and photograph it, properly, access isn't available. So this is a early 17th century fishing building in Lowestoft in a courtyard, shot in awful light, in complete shade, with what looks like a builder's yard out front and a row of skips. When all of that was gone, the building was encompassed by a modern development that we couldn't get access to. So this became the one image that we had. So although the tendency with fieldwork images is just to snap happily so that when you go back to write up whatever it is you're writing, you can remember what you saw. If there is an opportunity to take some clean, nice publication quality images, do take them, because there's not always the chance to go back. Is the illustration for a reference work, or is it for something that's a bit more in the realms of a popular publication or a website, or something where an image, so for a reference work which may be describing the architectural features of this phenomenal Romanesque doorway at the Church of Kilpeck in Herefordshire, you would want a very square image shot in relatively flat light so that you can see all of the detail of those carvings. You may choose to take that image differently for a different purpose. You'll notice that I will skip part, oh yes, color or black and white. So the VCH largely publishes its photographs, for example, in black and white in its reference volumes. Most images will be taken in color, and that conversion from RGB or CMYK to black and white does alter slightly the lighting and the detail. So if you know that your output or your publication is going to be black and white, it may be worth configuring the camera to shoot in black and white. Most SLRs will let you do that, rather than shooting in RGB and then converting. You'll notice I've not got a picture of one perfect shot because I've yet to produce one. But the point I mean is, are you going to one place to take one photo of one aspect? And with that in mind, like planning, make sure that you familiarize yourself with the site. Look at maps, look at other images that exist online, and make liberal use of Google Street View, and if possible, although I appreciate it isn't, a site recce in advance to think about how best to tackle the area that you want to photograph. These two Street View examples give you a sense of the information that you can learn. So Street Views are updated really regularly. So the remains of the monastic almshouse, now Priory House in Dunstable, was briefly under scaffolding and behind hoarding, which would have been irritating to find out if you turned up on site cold. And the Freemasons Hall in central London, the Google view gives you a real strong sense of where the sun is in the sky in relation to trying to shoot that main facade. And actually you'd have been staring straight into bright sunlight and the elevations down the side in shade. So it gives you some pointers as to things you might need to take on board. But really, the main thing is the composition, is what goes in the photograph, and what you're trying to show, and also, you know, what is the building saying? What story is the photograph trying to tell? You know, are you taking a photograph with a specific caption in mind to illustrate a specific point within an article or a book or a piece of writing? And if so, have a clear idea of that in your composition. The building itself might not be the key. So this photograph of St Michael's Mount in Cornwall, captured at that particular time to show both the separate, you know, the island nature of it, the complete separation from the mainland by the water, but also the beginnings of the receding of the tide and the very first of the day's bold members of the public crossing the causeway, which you can just see in the foreground. That changes what you're trying to show, changes the composition, because actually if I was really only interested in the building, I probably wouldn't have taken it from that vantage point. Are we showing the whole building or are we showing a detail? This is inside the concrete seed silos, now gone, at Coleman's Mustard Works. And what I was trying to show here is both the combination of the processes, these are the sort of air moving pipes and moving seeds around, but also the precast concrete nature of the construction of the building. Do we need to take into account wider setting? Is that part of the story we're trying to tell? This is a closed pub in Sheffield in the Gleadless Valley estate. And I could have taken it from the main frontage, which had got a boarded up big picture window. But actually from this vantage, it's more interesting because the reason for that picture window's existence is the dramatic topography of the hills that ring Sheffield and the view out from that pub towards the Peak District beyond. And it's tempting in terms of composition to crowd lots of stuff in to try and show everything in a simple image. But actually the most effective ones are the ones where the composition is really simple. You know, don't overcomplicate it. But if there are ways of showing an interesting juxtaposition, that can also work really nicely too. This is Corby in Northamptonshire, a really nice contrast between the slightly sombre and half-tone sort of lit memorial statue to the men who worked in the steelworks, and behind it the almost garish gleaming brand new Corby Cube Civic Centre with its glass and polished metal surfaces reflecting in the bright sunlight. And similarly here, the Park Hill Estate in Sheffield, the largest listed building in Europe, showing the juxtaposition between the completed phase 1, where Urban Splash regenerated the flats, and the areas yet to be regenerated to the left. So you can do lots with the composition, but it really does, it really is everything. Landscapes are different. If any of you have been out looking at sort of earthworks and field archaeology and tried to take photos of them, you'll realize when you get back that the camera doesn't reflect the kind of contrast and depth of field that the human eye does, so you lose some of those distinctions. Here, the earthworks are really massive, but without capturing the bit of water in the middle where one of them semi-flooded, you lose a lot of that contrast. So landscapes, the challenge is a lot to do with capturing distinctions in contrast and light to show what you want to show. So this is a photo from from the Herefordshire Beacon, looking out towards Great Malvern along the Malvern Hills. At first, it looks like it's taken too early in the day, and believe me, it was very early in the day. But actually, that kind of half light with the ground frost still on the ground helps to bring out some of those contrasts in the earthworks, and the sun just clipping the tops of the hills really bring them up. Similarly here, this is up in Teesside by the steelworks, the extraction. Lots of flat bodies of similar colours, you know, sand on sand on sand, sky on sky, and quite a lot of work needs to be done in landscape photography to bring out those distinctions and contrasts within your composition. Another really good example here, both of these are by James Davies, an HE photographer. This is Silbury Hill in Wiltshire. Perfectly willing to accept huge amounts of shade and shadow, because allowing them into the foreground really makes the monument in the background pop, where the sun is on the face of Silbury Hill and everything else is sort of in half shadow, is really effective. To that end, lighting makes an enormous difference. Here's a really poor photograph that I took, which shows what happens if you shoot directly into sunlight. Everything's in shade, everything's in shadow. You lose huge amounts of the quality, resolution. What you're really hoping to do is have the light throwing really clear illumination across the main elevation. So here, this is the medieval bridge at Aylesford in Kent. Composition improved by the reflection from the water, you know, very simple trick, but always really effective. But by the light being thrown across that elevation, you get a really nice even light. And this was taken before lunch. The tendency or the attraction is to shoot in the middle of the day, high sun, loads of light, but actually you know, early mid-morning and later in the afternoon, the light is more gentle, softer, a bit more sympathetic, and can often generate a nicer result. You can also use light to create effect. This is inside steelworks. Another of James's photos with the light cascading in and lots of use of half shadow. The time of day, the light that's available at the time of day that you take the image can also help you tell a story about the building. This is a 1960s pub on the outskirts of Bath, shot in relatively flat light. This is James, not me, and producing a good record photo, but it's relatively uninspiring. What it doesn't do is give a feel for a pub. There's no sense of sort of warmth or people or, you know, a place of sort of sanctuary. But if you photograph it in the evening, the image is completely different. It changes with that sort of scent. It immediately feels a warmer, more inviting photograph, which helps to convey the use of the building. And I'm just seeing it now, I'm doing okay for time. And to that end, don't be afraid of the dark. Taking photographs in low light is more challenging, but there's all sorts of guides on how to do it online. And if you've got an SLR camera or even a bridge camera that allows you to manually set the shutter speed and to change the ISO settings, as long as you're set up on a tripod and there's no camera shake, you can generate really nice results. This is Hardwick New Hall in Derbyshire, one of mine, taken not in full darkness, but really, really late in the dusk, with the shutter wide open, flooding the image with light, giving this sort of amazing colour to the stone. And this is one of James's of the gas holder development by Coalyard's Drops at King's Cross earlier in the day, so less dark, but the fairy lights and the mirrored surfaces around the gas holder park, the one that doesn't have the flats in it, and then the sense of occupation, because these gas holders have now got residences within them, allows the photograph to say more than simply recording it on a well-lit sort of daytime. One of the greatest challenges associated with photographing buildings are converging verticals. This idea that if your building's got any height to it and you lean back in order to fit everything into the image, the final image will have this sense of all of the vertical lines of the building starting to move together to meet at a single point. It's not always a disaster, but it definitely changes the image that you've created. So it can be combated, straightforwardly by just moving further back. But in an urban context, that's not always possible. It can be combated by getting off the ground, getting higher up, and being sort of taking your photo from the building's equator rather than from the ground. Again, not always possible. If you have access to Photoshop, Photoshop does have this thing called lens correction. It's one of the tools. An opening lens correction in its custom setting puts a grid onto your photograph. And then you've got a series of tools that allow you to sort of de-warp, to bend the image forward and backwards, to tilt, to bring it towards you, away from you, back, forward, and essentially digitally correct those converging verticals. One tip with this: if you're trying to tilt the image back to you to straighten it up, as you tilt, the top of your image will go up and up and up. So unless you've left loads of sky above it, you won't be able to correct your image without cropping the top of it. So it's a great tool if you've got a small amount of verticals to correct. If you've got something like this, this is the famous parish church at Chesterfield with its twisted spire. I've not got enough image in that to correct that properly. And also you'll see this was a sort of a drive-by, a walk-by shooting, so to speak. And had I waited for a different time in the day or gone at a different time of the year, I'd have got a much more nicely lit image, and might have been able to combat those verticals with a bit more thought. One way of doing it is to get higher up. So the image on the left is the parish church at Ledbury with its detached bell tower, with its very tall spire. Trying to photograph that from beyond, so you've got that patch of grass, then you've got the wall, and beyond the wall is the bit the public can get into. It's the churchyard. You're right up against the front of that building. There is no way of getting anything usable there without tilting your camera right up, and the results are not very good. In this instance, the the verger was very took pity on me and gave me access to the rectory and upstairs from the landing of the rectory, shooting across the garden, was able to get a much more pleasing, squarer image. Similarly, this isn't by me, this is one of my HE colleagues, Chris, one of our photographers, looking to photograph the gas holder at Poplar before it was demolished. In a sort of a tight site that there wasn't a great position to get a really nice square image, managed to blag his way into the Balfron Tower, Goldfinger's housing development in Poplar, and get up to the 13th or 14th floor and take a photo out of someone's window, allowing him to get that nice square shot. Similarly, Kingsway Chapel off Oxford Street, central London. This is the street view snap, and you'll see it's a really tight urban environment, really tall spire, very difficult to photograph. But just to the right of the image is that sort of white stone raised elevated piazza that you can go up onto. And from there, with that advantage of extra height and a bit of distance, it's possible to take a really nice square photograph. If I do say so myself. Some practical considerations. There's lots of talk about permissions. You don't need permission to take photographs on public land. Remarkably, or of people, it's perfect. There is no law against it. You do need permission of the landowner to take photographs on private land. And if you're taking photos of private property from a public standpoint, although you're entirely entitled to do it, you may be challenged or asked questions as to what you're doing. One of the practical considerations is the abundance of street furniture, certainly movable street furniture, recycling bins, wheelie bins, things like that. It's your decision as a photographer whether you want to capture them or move them, whether you want a point-in-time record that shows them or you want a slightly cleaner, unencumbered image. If you're going to start shifting things around, definitely ask somebody, because that will annoy people. It's worth remembering that some organisations like the National Trust will allow you to take photographs at their properties, but won't allow you to reproduce them without speaking to them first and almost always paying some kind of reproduction fee. So it's not always the case that just because you've taken it and you've taken it from a place you're allowed to take it, you're allowed to reproduce it. In terms of things like GDPR, it's advisable to crop out or blur readable number plates or readable addresses. And in terms of people, if you're intending to use a photograph that you've taken, which has got somebody identifiable in it, or that person could, reasonably argue that they can identify themselves, you will need their permission in terms of a model release form, essentially a piece of paper that says they're happy to be in that photo and they're happy for you to use it. Because we often, me particularly, and we as buildings historians and archaeologists or even local historians, are very guilty about documenting places without people. We look to take photographs where nobody's in the way, nobody's in it, there are no cars, there's no movement, there's no people, which isn't always particularly representative, really. So the photo on the left, Chris Redgrave again, a really nice collection that you can find online called I Am London, which involved him taking places but with the people who were associated with them. So this is Bertold Lebetkin's sort of celebrated penguin pool at London Zoo with one of the keepers. You can also get this sense of people in place without falling foul of the GDPR in model release. So in the image on the right, taken by Anna Brigson for our gas holder project, she's used a long shutter speed, and the result is that anything moving is blurred and anything static is in focus. So you get this really lovely sense of movement, but the face of the cyclist is blurred and none of the number plates are readable. So I personally like to try and include some people in the photos, or at least a sense of habitation, people being adjacent to the things you're doing. But it is definitely worth remembering that any faces that can be identified, really, if you want to reproduce that image, you should have a model release form. I said I won't go too far into the technical considerations, and I won't, but if you want some, and I appreciate there may be some photographers in the room who are far more versed at these things than I am, but here are some very, very basic technical tips that you might want to incorporate. If the camera that you're using allows you to, it's always worth shooting to RAW as well as JPEG. RAW files I'll move on to in a minute, but they capture a huge amount more information relating to the color and the luminosity of the image, which means you can post-process it to correct things you don't like and to do lots of fancy stuff with the way that you light your shot. JPEGs are much smaller in file size, much easier to handle. You don't need specialist software to open them, but they are a representation of the image you took and don't capture that data within them, so you can do less to change them in post-process. If you're going to shoot in manual mode and you're taking architectural details, taking buildings, try and start with a really narrow aperture setting, sort of for f11, and a low ISO setting, 100 to 200, which will capture lots of detail and really reduce the noise in the image. Both a narrow aperture will obviously reduce the amount of light that's let into the lens, so you'll have to shoot at slightly longer shutter speeds to make sure your composition is lit properly. In the old days, that would involve using light meters because you have no preview of what you've shot when you're shooting to film. Now, because all the SLRs got these big viewing screens on the back, you can see whether you've got it, broadly speaking, right, and you can adjust the manual settings as you go. Although you can still get digital light meters, and better photographers than me will do all that, take light readings and adjust their camera accordingly. In low light or the kind of those evening shots that I showed you, you want a wider aperture and you want to up the ISO rating. So this will increase the sensitivity of the sensor of the camera, but it reduces the depth of field. So you won't be able to get those nice shots as easily where things in the foreground are in focus, things in the background in soft focus. I've always found that a wide angle lens, 10 to 20 millimeter is what I've used most, really helps to capture building elevations. It gives you the scope to capture in those full facades without having to get miles back. The problem with those wide angle lenses is that around the margins of the shot, they can get slightly soft in the focus, and they do slightly exaggerate that process of converging verticals, or that anomaly of converging verticals. So that's definitely something to watch out for. And as I mentioned, you can do a huge amount with Photoshop and post-processing, so long as you've shot to RAW. So the RAW files have all that color and luminescence information. And you can see just in the shot there, there's that histogram is essentially showing how to describe that: highlights, lowlights, and midtones. And you can start to bend that. If you've got, there's too much dark, you can reduce one, you can move one up, move one down until you get the kind of lighting of the white balance that you absolutely want. You can't do that with the JPEG because it just hasn't captured the information. If that's something that's interesting to you, I fully recommend you go and watch the video on YouTube that I've put on, that one of my other colleagues, Alan Ball, where he goes through step by step in real time how to use Photoshop to take a single RAW image and post-process it to make the most of what you've shot. It can certainly help you deal with images that are both under and overexposed, and also slightly start to tweak things to give some of those dramatic effects that I showed in some of James's evening photos. And I'll just finish with drone photography now, because this is something I do quite a lot of. Drone photography really has come on enormous amounts in the last 5 or 6 years in terms of the kind of quality of kits that the consumer can buy for relatively small sums of money, and the way in which that opens up huge potentials for me as an archaeologist, and for landscape photographers more generally. All of our in-house photographers are now drone pilots as well. They have slightly different drones to ours that are equipped with better camera sensors and use them, a lot. So it opens up the ability to take these sort of really wide landscape shots. This is a prehistoric tor enclosure in Cornwall, near St Stephen in Brannel, with the dramatic landscape of the China clay industry and the small China clay settlements strung out in the background. Obviously, an image that it would be impossible to get from the ground, but also an image that's really difficult to get by traditional aerial photography means, because this is, as a drone pilot, you are restricted to a maximum height of 400 feet above the ground, which is a good deal lower than a light aircraft would fly. So you can get a perspective that aerial photography can't get, that sort of low level oblique, and particularly in the raking winter sunlight, which you've got here, you can get some really dramatic and really clear effects. Again, this is at a really low altitude, 250, 300 feet off the ground, but at the right time of year. This is again early winter, early afternoon, early winter, with low sunlight, and that really helps pick out the contrast on what's essentially a green on green on green landscape to show the earthworks of this lost terrace garden and large house. I put this in just to give a really clear indication of the difference between shooting into the sun and shooting with the sun in a more optimal position. So shooting into the sun is not a hard no, and you can generate some really nice images. This is shot almost directly into the bright sunlight, and it's a nice enough photo. This is Fort Cumberland, Suffolk, England, sort of archaeology headquarters down in Portsmouth, 18th century Star Fort. But when you compare it to the shot with the sun from a different direction, taken a couple of minutes later, with the sun in a more optimal position, you get a really completely different color, hue, and saturation. All of those, all of the walls of the ramparts, which in the first image are in complete shadow, are in really clear focus here. You can see, well, I can see, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but where it's hovering, you've got really clear detail on some of the Second World War damage, bombing damage. So direct sunlight photos are not a no, and it's not impossible that you can get a good photograph, but the contrast with one shot with the sun in an optimum position is really stark, I think. It's also worth remembering that drone photography doesn't necessarily mean getting a long way up. Here's the church that we started with, St Leonard's in Sandridge, and we're barely above rooftop level here. But what it does allow you to do is get that really square-on photograph with no converging verticals, nice, crisp, straight lines for the tower on that nice brooch spire, which you can't do from the ground. And the image that I started with, the Star Trails image, there are converging verticals on that. It just isn't possible. So the drones do offer you an enormous amount of opportunity to take different types of photographs, or to enhance the kind of photographs that you were going to take anyway. And the sub 250 gram ones, which allow you to fly in what's known as the open category, because they're so light, they're deemed to be sort of less damaged than a sparrow if they were to fall out of the sky. You can fly them without having completed the expensive drone training, simply by registering with the CAA as an operator. And those DJI minis, which are full of kit and amazing cameras, coming at about 500 or 600 quid, I think. So they really are open to general consumers now in a way that they perhaps once weren't. And I'll finish with just a couple of things that you might find useful. Photographing Historic Buildings, a guide by Steve Cole, formerly English Heritage's lead photographer, which in itself is an update of Terry Buchanan's book. I put the Buchanan book on as well because obviously it's pre-digital. So there's lots, if you are interested in film photography and still do film photography, there's loads and loads of really useful tips in there into how to photograph buildings with film. And then the final one is you can just Google it, so it's freely available online. It's about recording historic buildings, but does have a section on the photographic record. So there's huge amounts of useful stuff in there, tips and guides. And I think I shall stop there.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was brilliant. And I have learnt lots of things, and I'm sure that others have too. If you just stop sharing your screen. Yep. Fantastic. Thank you. So if you have any questions for Matt, whether they're kind of general questions, you might have kind of some specific things that you'd like some help or advice with, just want to have a kind of open conversation about any of this, please do put something in the chat or raise your hand. While you're thinking, I had a few questions, Matt, or ask for help or advice. You talked a little bit sometimes around those kind of urban settings where it's very difficult to stand back from something if you've got a very narrow street, and that, you know, affects the angle that you're photographing in, but also where the light is and how much light can get in. Do you have any kind of tips for those kinds of contexts?
Well, it's always going to be a bit of a trade-off, I think. So I can think of one that springs to mind, trying to take a photograph of the main facade of the Royal Courts of Justice in central London, which is both a very long single facade, but also, I mean, it's off the Strand, so you can't go very far back to capture it. So there are a couple of options. One, you go sideways and you take the angle more, you take it as a more oblique image, so you're not square on, you're to one side, and you get that sort of, you know, perspective shot as the building recedes away from you, and then you can make your decision which bit you want in the foreground and which bit you want detail. So you could have, you know, and try not to capture the whole building, maybe start with the grand entrance and then the building disappearing sort of westwards. On that occasion, there's also a pub on the other side of the road that's got an upstairs restaurant area, and windows that aren't painted shut. So you can get up there, speak to the bar staff and ask if you can go up, and take a photograph out of the window, which instantly gets you 25 feet off the ground, and with a wide angle lens allows you to capture a lot more without essentially looking straight up. I think you'll find that particularly in the kind of work that you'll do, Ruth, where you're in small market town, village locations, that people will ask you what you're up to, and the chances of being invited into someone's house to get a view from their upstairs window is relatively high, particularly, I think, in the VCH context, where a county editor may have laid some groundwork for you by being active in that area to start with. I mean, it does make such a difference, a little bit of height. And again, the drone settings, the drones make, to be able just to be 40 feet, 50 feet off the deck makes it so much easier in that context. But then obviously if it's a very busy urban environment, then there are restrictions on whether you can use those at all. It's definitely a trade-off. What I would always look not to do is to look up. The image, I think it's preferable to have an image where some of the building is cropped out, but what's in is really nicely composed, nicely lit and square, than try and get the whole thing in at all costs, because there's always going to be some trade-offs and compromises there.
Yeah, some lateral thinking around what you're taking and where you're taking it from. In the chat, Helen has said, if you want to use an old photograph illustration working from an old photographic print, what approach would you recommend? Is this something you have much experience with? Yeah, so I assume you mean how do you, in terms of digitizing it rather than the permission thereof. So digitizing is tricky, particularly if you're in a record office or a library, and what you've got is an old photographic print in front of you, and you want to use it in your book, in your article. The temptation is to photograph it. The problem is that those environments are almost always quite harshly electrically lit, and photographic prints have a natural sort of reflective, shiny quality. So it's very, very difficult to take a photograph of a photograph that doesn't have a glare or reflection in it, or the shadow of yourself as the photographer. It's possible to do it. One way is if the archive or record office, wherever you are, has a different room, is you go and turn all the lights off. You set your camera up on a tripod, and then you almost take it like a nighttime photo by opening the shutter speed slowing the shutter speed right down
to allow in what little light there is to illuminate the photo of the photo, without there being glare and reflection. That same technique would hold for things like trying to photograph hung portraits in houses or stained glass or things like that. But by far the most effective way is to scan it. So record offices and collections will almost certainly have offer a digitization service for a fee where they would scan it for you. A simple home PC scanner is perfectly fine. It'll let you set the resolution right up to the kind of levels that you'd need for a publication. Some, again, off the shelf, not enormously expensive, will scan from 35mm slides or from glass negatives. It's just they just have a different backing to stop the light going through. They work really effectively as well in terms of capturing the resolution that you need. So that's what I've done in the past. I would say that photographing the photograph yourself is the least good option, but it is possible to produce something that's perfectly publishable. The thing that you would need to bear in mind always, and this is more Jamie's territory, is that even though you're the digital originator of the photo you've taken of that photo itself may be in copyright somewhere else. That's very much the case with things, postcards, particularly postcards from the 60s, feel like a free resource to reproduce, but almost always the photographic company that produced the image is still in business, and that image is still in copyright.
Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Helen. If not, please do kind of write in the chat. And as I probably should have mentioned this as an example earlier when we were listening to Jamie, but also kind of working out, if you're in a local archive, it might not be the local archive who owns the permission of the thing that's in the local archive. So in my own research, I regularly work with non-conformist archives that have been sort of deposited for the public to see in a local archive, but they are still owned by that congregation, and the amalgamation of those congregations may have changed over time. So, you know, what Jamie was saying about factoring in that time to gain permission for an image is really important, because you might have to go through 3 or 4 people until you get to somebody who can actually give you permission. So Christiana's asked, have you any suggestions on how to take a photo of a long distance hilly landscape that does not make it flat? Also standing on a hill with a steep drop down to a stream and show the depth.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So it's all about contrast. So if you are trying to take that long landscape shot and the light is very consistent, you'll get no contrast and it will flatten it and it will foreshorten it. I think a couple of the examples I showed, it's slightly counterintuitive. You take it at times that wouldn't necessarily be ideal for a photograph. So areas, so if you're particularly, you know, the tops of those hills in the distance might at certain times be in really bright sunlight when the rest of the landscape around it's in sort of half-tone shade, and that would accentuate the photograph, the bit of the photograph that you want to show. Similarly, the drop down to the stream, if you were able to find a point in time where the sunlight is reflecting off the water, then that will help to bring that out from the hill and the banks around it. It's a different challenge to taking buildings. The buildings, the flat light is actually your friend there, because you don't want big bouts of shade. You don't want that raking light across the front that masks any of the detail. For landscapes, actually you want the opposite. You want contrast, you want raking light, you want things that, so you can really brightly light the key element of the composition. In terms of depth of field, there's also, most cameras have a depth of field setting, so you can start to play around with it so that you can configure it. Definitely on an SLR and a bridge camera, you can configure it so that the target or the the subject, the thing you're most focused on, is in really sharp focus, and the things behind it are slightly softer in focus, slightly blurred out, which will help you bring that out. And then the final way of doing it is you can stack photos on top of each other. So you can take, particularly if you're on a tripod, so it's locked down and it's not going to move, you can take 2 photos of the same thing at completely different times of the day. And then when you stack them in Photoshop, you just take the target out of one and cut away the rest, and then it sits over the rest of the photo of the other one. That's a really sort of common post-processing technique. So you get these photos that look like the photographer's done an insane job in lighting the subject in a completely different way to the rest of the composition. That's because that's exactly what they've done. It's 2 or 3 photos. And that's the surest fire way of getting a really clear distinction between subject and a flattish landscape behind.
Thank you. And Alan has asked, please, can you say a little more about the actual process of setting up for a photograph of a painting behind glass? Any tips?
Yeah, I'd like to say that I've nailed this, but I haven't really. The best results that I've achieved have been where I've essentially shut out all of the light in that room. So compose the photo with some light on, so it's all framed nicely, and then shut the light down, and then open the shutter speed right up. Most SLRs have got a setting called bulb. So if you put the SLR on bulb, that means that the shutter will not close till you take your finger off the button. So if you set up on bulb, you open the shutter and you flood it with light, and then you stop the shutter. That's the best options that I found. So you shut out almost all ambient light, and then you do a really, really, really long exposure, 30, 40, 50 seconds, where it ekes out tiny, tiny amounts of natural light to light the image without there being any electric or sunlight which would reflect off the surface of the image. I think that's really the only way one can go about it. And even then, if that image is behind glass, it's really difficult. And then you're into the realms of using some kind of shift lens or using a wide angle lens and positioning yourself to one side of what you're trying to photograph so your reflection isn't in it, and then cropping, having the subject in just one half of the photo and then cropping it down. And given the size of the sensors of the cameras, you'll have enough resolution to be able to use what you take.
Thank
But
you.
the answer is, Alan, it's bloody difficult. I've never really done it enormously effectively. The really, really good photographers use for doing things like stained glass, they use light sensors, and then they match. They take a light reading one side and a light reading the other side, and they match the light as it passes through the glass and configure their camera to match it. So you get that. So what you're getting is you're capturing the genuine light as it sort of refracts through the coloured glass. Apparently.
Wow.
Again, it's the difference between capturing photographs while out doing stuff and going to a site for 2 days to take one photo.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, as you keep saying, that way up of what time do you have, what are you there to do, actually how, and this is kind of coming back to what Jamie was saying about you're not going to be able to have lots of images in publications anyway, so just working out exactly what you want to put in your publication and putting your time and energy into getting the good shot of that 1 or 2 things that you're going to be able to include in your publication, that's really important for telling the story that you want to tell. Matt, we were quickly talking about foliage earlier before we started, and what you can and can't do at certain times of the year because of that. And I noticed that many of the photographs that you showed us were taken in the winter where there weren't leaves on trees and all of those sorts of things. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit to that before we begin to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, that's the reason is twofold, really. One, because principally what I look at these days is landscapes, less buildings, where you've got earthworks, where you've got lumps and bumps. It is green on green on green, and the only way to accentuate those differences in height is to get low winter light across them, really. Covering of ground frost or a smattering of snow, all the better, really helps to make those pop out. But also it speaks a little bit to the idea that I don't go out to take photographs. I go out to record landscapes, and while I'm there, I take some photographs. And so because of foliage, our fieldwork season as landscape archaeologists is December through to about now. So lots of my landscapey stuff will be done in those slightly harsher, lower winter lights, whereas the the photographs from my sort of VCH days that I showed in those slides were all lit with much brighter sort of summery, or at least late spring kind of sunlight, where you get a nice, they're almost, you almost want polar opposite light conditions to do landscapes and doing buildings. Buildings, you want a slightly flatter and softer light across a facade so that you see all of those intricacies of the architectural detail. Landscapes, in order to introduce contrast where there isn't contrast, because it's lots of shades of the same greens and browns, you use light to achieve that, more shadow, more harshness of light.
Thank you. I was on some fieldwork in Westmoreland recently, and this was in February, and there was one building that is covered in vines growing over it. And actually the person that I was with was like, oh, this is the first time I've actually been able to see the building because it's all died back for the winter. And, you know, some of those pictures of churches that you showed, if there had been leaves on those trees, you wouldn't have been able to see anything of the church. Absolutely. Because there would have been so much in the way. And also they create more shadows, don't they, and affect the light in nice but weird ways when taking photographs.
I mean, I think what that highlights is that there are a vast array of sometimes conflicting considerations when it comes to how to photograph things, particularly built environment, particularly buildings and landscapes. And it sort of goes to that point I made that James was saying, that, you know, there are certain buildings, certain places that are only photographable once or twice a year, where everything is right, where the lighting's right, where the foliage is right, where you know, access is possible. So unless photography is all you do, there's always likely to be a trade-off. You know, you're saying that it's wisteria or ivy or whatever it is that's covering the front of that building is gone, so you can see more of the building, but the photo, casting no aspersions, probably isn't lit as nicely as you'd want it to be. No. Because you've got very harsh winter sunlight,
or no sunlight,
quite low angle. So yeah, it's a lot of it is compromise, but it's fun to do.
Yeah, great. We're going to wrap it up there. Thank you everybody so much for coming.